Nuclear weapons, goose-stepping soldiers and Kim Jong-un are the first images that come to mind when we think about North Korea and its capital city of Pyongyang. Rarely do we get to see or hear about the day-to-day lives of the 2.9 million people residing in the city. But Lindsey Miller is a musical director and award-winning composer who lived in Pyongyang between 2017 and 2019 while accompanying her husband on a diplomatic posting. During her time there, she captured photos depicting her everyday surroundings, travels, experiences, and friendships that she formed in the secretive state. Her book, North Korea Like Nowhere Else, takes us inside one of the world's most heavily guarded borders and sheds light on the surreal normalcy of life in the secretive state. A very welcome to you, Lindsay. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's lovely to see you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Right, and we're celebrating the launch of your book today in the UK. And before we get to anything else, first of all, during your time in North Korea, where did you find good coffee in Pyongyang?
So that was something that I was really surprised to find, was that there are places to go for coffee in Pyongyang. There are many coffee shops around the city, and quite a lot of them have quite trendy interiors that have obviously been influenced by the types of interior design we'd see elsewhere. So trendy chalkboards and mixed coffees and cocktail lists and so on. So it's definitely a sign of the outside world being present in Pyongyang in some way, or someone having brought that information back with them.
Right, so we don't normally tend to think about baristas or hipsters going to cafes in Pyongyang, but there you have it, some things about North Korea that we didn't know already being revealed. And during your 2-year experience in Pyongyang, you took up photography, and you've now published this book, which is the first by a Westerner to publish a book with photos on North Korea. How did you begin this journey?
So that's a really interesting question. I think the important thing for me in the journey is that I never went with the intention of creating any kind of photography piece or written piece about my time there. It was after I got over the initial shock of arriving in the country that I realized that the people I was seeing in front of me were real. And I know that's a really simple thing to say, but it took on a beating heart in a way that I hadn't recognized before, having only seen North Korea portrayed in the media and through books and documentaries and so on. And I really struggled to understand the place and trust the environment and people there. And I realized there was so much I couldn't see beyond the surface. So, for example, women in the street, I would walk past and wonder, who is she? What has she been through? What is her life? What is her future? Who is she in a relationship with? Does she have a family? And photography allowed me a way to express myself creatively in the way that I saw the place, which wasn't through the regime's lens of propaganda and what it wanted us to see. Even though Pyongyang still is an idealized version of the country, it was more that I could see the people for my own eyes and the human connection that came about in my relationships with people. And I really hope readers enjoy experiencing what I experienced in this book and connecting with people there.
Right, because we don't tend to think about the individuals in the propaganda that we see from the North. We see them collectively, we think of them just as North Koreans walking through Kim Il-sung Square, goose-stepping or cheering. But yeah, as you mentioned, the ordinary really is often the most interesting. And what aspects of daily life did you find most similar and also most different to how we live in this outside world in other societies?
So I think a big difference for me was the fact that, as with anybody in North Korea, any outsider, there are rules and restrictions you have to adhere to that you wouldn't experience elsewhere. For example, in the UK, I can walk down the street in relative anonymity. In North Korea, I would be stared at a lot, but that's understandable because I realized I was a 3D walking, talking representation of the outside world, and I wanted people to have a positive experience with somebody. And it made me realize how I dress, how I speak to people, that everything would be taken on board by anyone who didn't know me. But the big challenge for me really was the social isolation and struggling to have spontaneous relationships with people. And meeting new people and getting to know the local people is something I think anybody feels naturally drawn towards in a new place. But in North Korea, it's not that simple. where conversations you have with people can be shut down for various reasons, or you don't want to put someone at risk by asking them a certain thing, but you still want that human connection. In terms of similarities, again, it's so simple, but people are people. I met lots of North Korean people who love to drink, who love to spend time with their family, who love to enjoy the outdoors, had an appreciation of nature, felt tired at their jobs. Some even complained to me how they were fed up that they couldn't pursue any hobbies because they were so busy with their family life and their work life. And I think it's really easy to see the North Korean people through this caricature that we have as being robotic or brainwashed. And I think that's a really overly simplistic view. And I think we need to take responsibility as outsiders to open our minds beyond those caricatures and actually see the North Korean people, as human beings, and go beyond the politics and get to the human heart of the place, which is the people there.
Right, and as you said, people are people at the end of the day. And well, among the people, North Korea's Gen Z, Generation Z and millennials, are they just as obsessed with taking selfies? Do they have their own way of being stylish, hipster and knowing better than the oldies?
So I think that's really interesting, and that's something I really enjoyed speaking to younger North Korean people about. And something for me that really stood out was the presence of technology. And some North Koreans I spoke to who had children would often complain about how addicted they were to their phones, or they were addicted to video games, and they would be quite disgruntled, saying they really need to be studying, or they should be playing outdoors and being outside in the fresh air. And I think we can all identify with that problem of technology kind of overtaking other things we should be doing and being distracting. I think what was also interesting was, for me, talking to a lot of young North Korean women and asking them about their lives. And some of them even mentioned to me that they didn't want children, they wanted to have a career. And obviously, that's not going to be representative of all North Korean women, and we know that everyone's experience is different. But for a couple of women I spoke to in Pyongyang, it was really interesting to hear their views of rejecting that traditional gender role and wanting to pursue a career over family or a marriage.
Well, it sounds like during your time there, you really made deep connections with some people, and you were able to really connect with people in very surprising, unexpected ways. And while we tend to have fixed images when we think of life in North Korea, as the rest of the world, we have very limited access to photos or video footage that the state media might provide. And we also know that foreigners in North Korea, what they get to see is strictly controlled by the regime. How close do you think you were able to get? And while taking your photos, were you ever stopped or looked at with suspicion?
So again, that's a really good question. I think it's really difficult to try and get any sense of how truly close you can get to the place of the people there, because the line of authenticity and falseness is never clear, and what is reality and what isn't becomes a blurred line. And for me, it was really important to try and use the opportunity of being there and the freedoms that I had to explore the place as much as possible. And that is in a way that tourists wouldn't get to experience. So for example, with diplomatic freedoms, we could walk or drive around Pyongyang freely without minders or guides. We could go to Nampo for the day. We could even go to Wonsan. With going to Wonsan, we would normally have to give notification, but then there were stories of other foreigners going to Wonsan who didn't have to give notification. So even in the official lines of what was and wasn't possible was also blurred. And it didn't even mean, though, that it was a free-for-all, even though we could walk and travel around the city. I have written about in the book about an experience I had of going to a restaurant that was full of soldiers eating and drinking very casually in their white vests and their shirts draped over their seats. And I was turned away from that restaurant and I with no explanation. But then the next day it was absolutely fine. So I think in terms of being there, it's a balance of exploring and trying to not bend the rules per se, but to try and find your own way through things without being shut down at any opportunity. And it's a complicated one of how close you can get. And I've written about that in the book. And I had to really trust my instincts when it came to people. and relationships I had with them, whether they were talking to me because they were genuinely interested or if they had some kind of ulterior motive. But as I mentioned, I just had to trust my instincts in that moment and make the decision on whether I could trust them or not. And actually, most of the time, it felt very genuinely friendly, and I found the people to be really warm, really generous, and very kind.
Well, it's incredible how you managed to uncover some of the layers of the realities that seem to exist in Pyongyang. And well, the 2 years that you spent in that city, it was actually one of the most exciting times in inter-Korean relations and US-North Korea relations as well. How did the atmosphere really change in Pyongyang among the citizens as all these excitable events happened? And how did they react to these very dramatical political shifts?
So as we know, in 2017, it was a really tense year, particularly between the US and DPRK. And with the rhetoric that was flying backwards and forwards between both leaders, it led to several rhetoric spats. And we also saw the nuclear tests and the missile tests, several missile tests that I was in the country for. And in 2018, it really did feel like there was a real shift in mood. And I think a lot of the foreign community felt skeptical, a lot felt very optimistic. It was, and among North Koreans in particular, from those I spoke to, they also felt a sense of optimism about things, even if as outsiders we may look at that with skepticism. There on the ground, it really did feel like there had been a shift and there was something to look forward to. I do remember standing with a group of North Koreans watching the North Korean state media show Kim Jong-un getting off the train to visit the Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Beijing for the first time. And that was in the days after it happened. Foreigners who were there could watch international news and see things as they were happening. But for North Koreans, the state media, state news would report it in the days after. And so for them, in the meantime, the North Koreans who had access to foreigners were asking lots of questions, trying to plug the gaps to find out what was going on. And when I watched that with them, they genuinely seemed really excited. And it was the same for the 2018 Singapore summit, where there was a real sense of optimism and lightness in the air. And some North Koreans I spoke to mentioned how much lighter they felt. And even if in the grand scheme of things, subjectively or objectively, people may think that that wasn't real, it really did feel that way when we were there. And it felt like a huge relief to what we'd experienced the year before.
Well, to what extent would you say North Koreans are aware or knowledgeable about the world that lies beyond their borders? And particularly, what do they think of South Koreans?
So I think for me, one of my biggest assumptions that I had about people there was that particularly in the countryside and in Pyongyang, that there wouldn't be a huge amount of access to outside information. And I never saw that information being passed around for myself, and I wouldn't, because it's punishable by execution and potentially being sent to prison camps, etc. But what was obvious to me was the effect that the outside world, knowledge of the outside world, whether that was through speaking a foreign language or having travelled there for themselves as part of work, or whether that was through access to foreigners, there was a really big change in the way that people behaved. They were much more open. There was a different energy about people. And you just felt like there was a different openness there that might not have been there otherwise. I remember watching the 2018 Inter-Korean pop concert in Pyongyang and being among thousands of North Koreans watching the show, and just wondering how many people had actually heard the songs that were being sung before. I did have a conversation with one North Korean who asked me about Seoul and asked me about South Korea because I'd recently been on a trip there. But the conversation quickly moved on to other countries as well. But they were also asking about Hong Kong, and they were asking about other countries. So again, I think there is a curiosity for the outside world. There is a confidence that comes with people who are comfortable around outsiders. And I think that's why any outsider who is in North Korea has to take the responsibility seriously and appropriately for being the person who can, live and exist and be that information to somebody.
And the information that flows in and out of the regime, it's never complete for the receiving end, I suppose. But, well, we don't know exactly what's going on in North Korea amid this COVID-19 pandemic. But having lived there, how do you imagine North Koreans would be coping with the situation right now?
It's something that has stayed in my mind ever since I've left is how are my friends? Are they healthy? Are they happy? Are they safe? And also for the many North Koreans that I don't know, that, you know, there's 25 million people in the country, some who will never, you know, we will never see as outsiders, but we know who are there. And I think a huge factor at the moment, particularly with the border closure, is really putting the country under a lot of pressure. And that goes from the level of food security. You know, North Korea's government can not even afford to feed its own people as it stands. And North Korean people themselves rely on that border being open to bring goods back and forth in order to sell them and supplement their state income, which is just not enough to live on. And so the border provides a lifeline for the country at state level and also at a very localized everyday level for people. And I think it's devastating for the people who are there who are already struggling. And I also think in terms of vaccines, you know, I've read recently that the North Korean state media is trying to stop information about vaccines existing from being broadcast to the people there. And it just makes you wonder, you know, the power of information is so powerful, and it could affect so much change in the way people think, that it's obvious that the regime really wants to control that even more. But I think with the borders being closed, it's even more important that we don't close our minds off to the people there and the struggles and the needs that they have, and to not get distracted by the nuclear program and the taunting and the rhetoric that North Korea sends towards the US, and to really hone in on what's most important, and that is the 25 million people who are there even more isolated than they were before.
And of course, photos always give us a chance to look back and reflect on the things that have happened and shaped us. How did your experience in North Korea change you as a person and also as an artist?
I think for me, it's really important in what I do to find the truth of a narrative, the truth of a story, a connection to honesty. And that's something I really wanted to try and do in this piece as much as I could. I think it's really difficult to try and get to the truth of anything in North Korea because it's very good at controlling its image about itself and information about itself, and it's been doing a very good job of that for a very long time. But I think it's also really important to not let that be a barrier to give up, and even in small ways to try and highlight everyday realities in order to create some kind of human connection. And I think the power of photographs is one that I really hope that people, there's two things, that people can read this piece and self-reflect and ask themselves, what is it that we do or don't know about our own judgments and assumptions about people? What are those things based on? Do we know how deep those assumptions really go? And is it actually stopping us from connecting and accepting the brutal realities of what people have to go through there? Are we distancing ourselves? What does this say about us? And then the second layer to that is also to actually be with these photographs, be with these people, spend time with them, look into their eyes and spend time with them. And even just for a moment to feel if I can create any kind of open window, just as I would in a piece of music, even in a very, very small way, then I really hope that that contributes to a wider conversation about keeping North Korean people present in our minds so that we can hopefully do something to help.
Really keeping the people at the centre of the issue when it comes to North Korea. And well, during your time there, you did also get to travel around quite a bit. The coastlines, you hiked up mountains, which I would never do here in Seoul, but yeah, you took the initiative of doing that. But do you have any favourite travel spots that you would recommend in North Korea? And among them, what was the most Instagrammable one?
I think for me, I mean, I've grown up in Scotland. I love the outdoors. my family are all really into hiking and being in the mountains and the fresh air. And something that I really connected with while being there was an appreciation of the outdoors. And a particular favorite place for me was Mount Myohyang, which is maybe about an hour and a half drive away from Pyongyang. And it's so peaceful, so calm and beautiful. And there's a huge ravine of these silvery grey rocks and water flowing down that creates these aquamarine pools of water, sometimes with fish in them. And you can smell barbecue from the trees, you know, even though there are signs up saying no fires, no forest fires, there are always people having barbecue somewhere and singing and carrying karaoke machines up the sides of these hiking trails in heeled shoes and people just having fun. And it was in that place that I felt, you know, I could be anywhere. And I think to be able to say that in a country like that it was a really powerful moment for me. And to be able to share in that joy of natural beauty that isn't to do with the regime, even though the regime may have carved sayings into the rocks, that there was a different sense of appreciation and openness there in that space. And so that's definitely a place that's very close to my heart and that I really enjoyed spending time in.
Right, one of the very few moments where it can be liberating, I suppose, in North Korea. So although if I do get the chance to go there, I suppose I'll go and check out the barbecue centre trees and the karaoke singing. But, well, lastly, before we let you go, what do you hope people will see in your photos as they read your book?
So I think the thing for me is that, as I mentioned earlier, I really would like people to look at this piece as an opportunity to firstly self-reflect and to, in the way that I had to admit my own ignorance when I went there and my naivety and my oversimplification of people and the depth of control that stretched through the country. I really hope that readers really feel what it is like to be in a place that is so confusing, where you question everything from the authenticity of a passing conversation in the street to an in-depth conversation with somebody in a bar, to the smiles on someone's face in a crowd watching a parade, to a child playing in a playground, that people really self-reflect and take responsibility and ownership over our own views and maybe open their minds to having to stand back from those assumptions and start again, because that's what I really felt I had to do when I was there. And secondly, I really would like readers to just spend time there, spend time in that state of mind that I found myself in, of constant questioning and confusion and trying to make sense of the place and still try to build a human connection at the same time. And I think the most important message that I have through this piece is that behind every political drama and power play, there is a human story. And there are 25 million people living in North Korea. And it's our responsibility to have an open heart and to openly read as much as we can and inform ourselves and keep them relevant and keep talking about them and to not forget them and not allow them to be shut off from us just because the borders are closed.
And this book really provides the perfect opportunity to do that, to really open our eyes on what's normally unseen when we think about North Korea and see the images that we normally get from their state media. But that was Lindsey Miller, British musical director and author of North Korea Like Nowhere Else. Her book is now available in bookstores both online and offline, so don't miss that. It will make a lovely weekend read. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Lindsay.
Thank you for having me.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.